Sir Drummond Bone is the person that Voices from Oxford is interviewing today. Sir Drummond Bone is no stranger to the media, and he's been in public life, in education and in other walks of life for very many years. He was a graduate of Glasgow University and of Balliol College in Oxford University. He has lectured at a number of universities around the United Kingdom. He has been the head of 2 major universities in Britain, and he came recently as the new master, that is the president, of Balliol College in the University of Oxford. But the real reason that we're talking to him today is that he is expert on one of the most lively characters in English history, Lord Byron. Now, what I'd like to do, though, to begin with, Drummond, is to say, first of all, welcome back to Oxford University and back to Balliol College, your own college in this university. What does it feel like becoming master of the college now?
Strange, wonderful, but strange. It was the last thing on my mind only a year or so ago. But it's great coming back, obviously, and
yes.
My wife worked here for a long while as well at Oxford
Yes.
University Press, so it's like coming home.
So we are actually in your sitting room at the moment, and you know it feels like a home. The atmosphere is that of a living room, isn't it?
I think that's right, and I think the college feels like a family environment, and,
yes.
and just as you were saying, that's exactly why we're able to look after students in a way we simply couldn't in
that's
a
right.
large university.
Yes, exactly. One other question before we get on to the real subject of this interview. There have been historic connections between Glasgow University
Yes.
and the University of Oxford, and Balliol College in particular, for a long time. So you are, in a sense, the latest inheritor of that particular link. Is that a good way to put it?
Well, it's a very grand way to put it. I think one of the first people, of course, who made that link was Adam Smith.
Yes.
So
the famous economist.
The famous economist, that's right, who was a Snell exhibitioner, and
yes.
I was very proud to be a Snell
exhibitioner, precisely, when you were here.
And then to come back as master, it's very much the icing on the cake.
Right. Now I want to switch to what I think our viewers are going to want to hear about, which is what got you interested in Byron?
Well, I think like most life decisions, it's partly choice and partly serendipity.
Right.
I wanted to work on irony. I think
yes.
because I just like the idea of there being no simple solutions to things.
Yes.
And people being able to hold 2 contradictory ideas in their head at the same time.
Yes.
So I could have worked on a number of authors as examples of irony.
Right.
Could have been Lawrence Sterne, could have been Herman Melville. But when the examination for the Snell exhibition took place,
right.
I happened to be working on Byron.
Right.
And so I said, I'm going to work on irony in Byron. And lo and behold, for the rest of my life, I have had the label
yes.
of Byron around my neck, and he's been a very happy label to deal with.
He must be. How should we put it? His life was like that of a rocket taking off at vast speed. He writes in just a few years enormous numbers of poems, letters, and other. How on earth did he do this?
Well,
what was his life like?
That is a bit of a mystery. He's sometimes called the first pop star, and his fame was not only national; it was
international.
European. It was international.
Yes.
It was
yes.
international.
And famously Greece.
And famously Greece, but not just Greece.
No.
I mean, one of the things I've discovered is that he's a ticket to travel anywhere.
Yes.
There are big groups of admirers of Byron in Russia. In Japan, in Greece, and most astonishing if you think of Greece, in Turkey as well.
Yes.
So for all kinds of different
right.
reasons, he has a sort of worldwide fame. But he did write a huge amount. Maybe about 8 volumes of poetry,
Yes.
7 volumes of letters, a huge amount of sort of miscellaneous prose on top of that as well.
Yes.
At the same time as having what one would have to say was a rather extravagant social life.
Well, that's what I want to explore with you, John, because, I mean, we can imagine a poet in his garret writing away maybe 8 hours a day, producing volumes like this.
Yeah.
But the man lived one of the most extraordinary and scandalous lives that anybody could live. We don't know how many, well, not just women, but also men that he related to in a sexual way. How on earth did he manage to put all of this together and somehow both live life and write what he wrote? Or is it that the one inspired the other?
Yes, I think you have to think it was the one inspired the other. He says sometimes that nobody should write who hasn't experienced the world.
Right, that's a nice quote.
And he's very forceful about that.
Yes.
That people who are all author, he says, are of no interest to him.
Right.
And he goes on about their ink-stained fingers and all the rest of it. You have to have lived in the world. You have to have been a man of the world.
Yes.
You have to have been an actor in the world.
An actor in the
world.
world. So you've got to know life to write about it.
That's right.
I like that.
That's right.
Yes.
And that's very much his point of view. But there's another mystery, because he sometimes presents his writing as if it came very easily to him, and in some way, of course, it must have.
Otherwise he couldn't produce the volumes that he produced.
But when you look at his manuscripts, they are full of corrections and
Right.
changes. So it wasn't just the...
So he was actually meticulous.
He was.
Yes.
He was,
Yes.
and a great technician.
Yes.
And he was very interested in the technique of writing as well.
Yes. So when, for example, he made words rhyme, he respected the words themselves. Is that a good way to put part of it?
He was very conscious that language is a matter of convention.
Right.
It's not something which is just like a block of concrete in the,
It's got to
in
sound
the world.
right.
It's got to sound right, and
Yes.
he also wanted people to realise that they were dealing with a medium,
Right.
so that it wasn't just like a tree that grew, as it were, but it was a
Yes.
man-made thing,
Yes.
a man-made construction.
Yes.
And so he was very self-conscious, particularly in his later years, very self-conscious about
Yes.
technique.
Before we come to some examples of that, because we'd love you to actually recite, because that's the only way to do it, isn't it? Some of his poetry. Before we come to that, though, just on his own personal life, one of his women commented, he was mad, bad and dangerous to know. It was the most famous quote on Byron, isn't it?
This is Caroline Lamb.
Yes, that's right, Caroline Lamb.
And
yes.
Carol Lamb, of course, well, she was probably right. I think he, I don't know that he was mad in any clinical sense, but he was certainly dangerous to know. I think there's no two ways about that.
He must have broken many hearts.
He broke many hearts. Yes. I think the interesting thing about his bisexuality is that it was more often than not culturally determined.
Right.
So that in certain societies where certain things were permitted,
Yes.
he would indulge, if I can put it that
Oh,
way.
I see. So he had a sense of what was.
He had a sense of
allowed in-
cultural appropriateness.
Yes.
The one exception to that, of course, was his affair with his half sister.
Right.
And that caused enormous trouble in England.
Yes. Is that what led to him leaving England?
And that's more or less what led to him.
And that's when he
Yes,
went
that's
to the
right.
continent. And he never came back.
He never came back. He left England in 1816 and
never came back.
came back.
Yes. Now, I think we really, as somebody who is an expert on Byron, we really need to ask you what you regard as favourite poems of his. Are you prepared to recite something for us?
Yes, I'm prepared. I'm always prepared to read
Yeah.
Byron,
Yes.
and I do think you have to hear Byron.
Yes.
I think for modern readers who just simply read Byron on the page, it can be quite difficult to actually hear what he intended. So yes, I'm a great believer in reading.
Yes.
Favourite poems? Well, that's like your Desert Island Distance.
Of course,
it's a very difficult.
Yes. Yes.
Byron's work divides roughly into two: the work he wrote before he left England in 1816, and the work he wrote he wrote
yes,
afterwards.
right.
And there's two very different kinds. So what I'd like to do is read one very short poem from the
Yes.
before he left
Yes.
Britain.
Yes.
And this, I think, is the kind of work for which he became famous in the 19th century.
Right.
Very intense, very lyrical,
Right.
gloomy. And then I'd like to read something that he wrote after he left.
Well, with pleasure, and we will make sure that our listeners and viewers can see the text scrolling down as you read.
And I should perhaps say that my Scottish accent is appropriate
Right.
because we know that Byron spoke with a slight Scottish accent.
Even though he was born in Dover?
He was born in London.
In London?
He was born in what is now Selfridge's store
Oh my goodness.
in London.
Oh, I
and there is a
didn't know
room with a plaque.
Yes,
That's
right.
where he was born.
In Selfridges.
He was in Selfridges. He was then brought up in Aberdeen,
Yes.
and then he came down to England.
Right.
But people comment always that he pronounced his name Byron, and they write with the double R or triple R.
Byron being what he picked up in Aberdeen.
Aberdeen, that's
Yes.
right.
Very interesting. So, in the authentic,
So with a little
slightly
touch of Scottish accent, little touch of Scottish
some
accent.
Byron poetry,
Some Byron
Sir
poetry.
Drummond Bone.
I'll have to, even though I should really know this, I'll put my glasses on to make sure I get it right. Short poem called Son of the Sleepless. Son of the sleepless, melancholy star, whose tearful beam glows tremulously far, that show'st the darkness thou canst not dispel, how like art thou to joy remembered well? So gleams the past, the light of other days, which shines but warms not with its powerless rays. A night beam sorrow watcheth to behold, distinct but distant, clear but oh, how cold. And that, I think, is very typical of Byron's early.
That's the early.
lyric.
Joy remembered well.
Well, and
That's lovely, isn't it?
distinct but distant, clear but oh, how cold.
So he uses this sort of...
Half-line structure there.
Yes.
We shouldn't get too technical.
No,
but,
but I think that even those of us who are not very familiar with the technology of poetry can appreciate that sort of lilt and contrast. And
that's right, that
yes.
sort of symmetry. I mean, he,
Yes.
he starts the first two words of that last line with the word D, and then he ends the line with the word D. So he's completing a circle there.
Yes.
He's thinking not only about memory, about the sort of perennial feeling maybe that all humans have of being exiled from the garden.
Yes. Yes.
Things were better in the past.
In the
things were
past,
better.
yes.
Yes, exactly.
Mm.
But we know from the context of this poem too that he was also thinking about writing as against life.
Yes.
That writing was distinct, but
Yes.
distant and cold.
Ah, right.
compared-
So this is also expressing
life.
his eventual view that only those who experience life can write about it.
Exactly.
Yes, sure.
Exactly.
So that's an example from his period before leaving England. You now have an example from the period when you went abroad.
I have, and this is, I suppose, one of my favourite pieces of Byron. It's from his very long comic epic poem, Don Juan.
Now, I like the fact you said Don Juan. Now, I would naturally say Don Juan.
And of course, if you were a Spanish speaker, you would be correct.
Exactly so, yes.
Byron was actually a very good linguist.
So this is not a mistake.
It's not a mistake. It's a deliberate, if you like, it's a deliberate mistake.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes.
And we know he has to. We have to pronounce it Juan because of the scansion, the way the rhythm
Right.
in the poem works.
Yes,
That
sure.
he clearly heard Juan,
Yes.
but he's doing that deliberately.
Indeed, yeah, yes, indeed.
And of course, it's a hugely long poem which was unfinished at the time of his death.
Yes.
Now, the passage I'm reading from, he's just been talking about great art and great philosophy. And he's been talking about Locke and Bacon and Socrates and the great religious philosophers.
Right.
And he says, I'm not like that. I don't do that kind of thing.
So he wasn't, if I may just put the context here, he wasn't intellectualizing things. He was trying to describe life as it is.
Exactly.
In the raw, And my goodness me, given his life, he knew what life was like in the raw.
Absolutely.
And the excitement too.
Absolutely.
It was a bit of both, wasn't
He was a bit of both.
Yeah.
And I think you can hear here that sort of excitement for the social and the erotic life.
Yes.
But you can also hear, and we might spend a minute about this, you can also hear about his politics, his political life as well, which he was very active too.
Okay.
So I'm not, he's saying I'm not talking about great ideas here. I perch upon an humbler promontory, amidst life's infinite variety, with no great care for what is nicknamed glory, but speculating as I cast mine eye on what may suit or may not suit my story, and never straining hard to versify, I rattle on exactly as I talk with anybody on a ride or walk. I don't know that there may be much ability shown in this sort of desultory rhyme, but there's a conversational facility which may round off an hour upon a time. Of this I'm sure at least there's no servility in mine irregularity of chime, which rings what's uppermost of new or hoary, just as I feel the improvisatore. A modest hope, but modesty's my forte, pride my feeble. Let us ramble on. I meant to make this poem very short, but now I can't tell where it may not run. No doubt, if I'd wished to pay my court to critics, or to hail the setting sun of tyranny of all kinds, my concision were more, but I was born for opposition.
That is fantastic.
It's great stuff, isn't it?
It's lovely because it's almost conversational, isn't it? That's
It
the
is.
first thing.
It is.
I mean, you could say that, all right, it's a poem. We know it's a poem. It scans well, rhymes well, but it's as though he's talking to somebody, isn't it?
And the extraordinary thing about that is he's actually writing in a verse form which is not English. It's an Italian verse form borrowed from Italy.
Yes.
And it's very, very difficult to write in English.
In that way.
And yet he makes it sound as if it's absolutely
Well,
natural.
it sounds
and
perfectly
conversational.
natural. But there's also, is he using irony against himself?
Yes, he's using irony. I think it's very, very difficult to tell where Byron's irony is pointed. It's pointed in almost every direction.
Yes.
But the interesting thing, I think, is your first reaction there. Your first reaction was that you were hearing a man talking to you.
That's right.
So although there's irony everywhere, it has a kind of personal warmth.
Yes.
It has this sense of a human voice talking.
Yes.
And that, I think, is very important for late Byron as well.
Yes. There are presumably, if we go back to what in his own life inspired this fantastic poetic way, are there clear signs in his poetry of the extraordinary nature of, well, let's face it, his sex life was extraordinary. And so we've got the word out now. Are there signs in the poetry that is true? Or is he, as it were, hiding the...
Oh no! I mean, Don Juan was an absolute scandal at the time. It was a succès scandal.
Yes.
He doesn't hide, and there is some pretty explicit erotic stuff in Don Juan particularly, but in the other poems as well.
Yes. Yes.
One of his greatest later poems is called Beppo, and that ends with a ménage à trois being set up.
A ménage à trois is three in a bed.
Three in a bed. Three in a bed. Yes, exactly. In this particular case, two men and one woman.
Yes.
And it's about tolerate. The poem is about toleration.
Yes.
Not only sexual toleration, but religious toleration as well.
Right.
But again, very difficult for his contemporaries to swallow.
Is it possible to view? I mean, in a sense, he was a libertarian, wasn't he?
Yes.
A sort of let's live life freely.
Yeah.
Is that partly the going abroad phenomenon, finding a different culture, a different view of life? I mean, even today, we can, I mean, it's the recent sex scandal for the head of the IMF shows the difference of perception
Cultures, yes.
about sex life between, say,
Yes.
France and the United States. In that case, very, very evident.
Well, I think that's certainly true. I mean, he went to Greece when he was quite young, and
Yes.
the sexual mores in Greece were very different,
They're very
obviously,
different. Yes, sure.
from in England, and I think that did give him a sense of possibility.
Yes.
Cosmopolitan was one of his favourite words. He liked
Right.
the idea of the
Yes.
word cosmopolitan.
Yes.
And when he left England, of course, in 1816, that coincided with this freeing up
Indeed.
of the way he actually wrote his
Yes.
poetry. And he was no longer writing for an audience, which he very much was doing in England, because
Yes.
he was very, very popular. He was a
Right.
bestseller,
Right.
and he was very conscious of his audience. And he wrote
Yes.
what we would now call sequels
Right.
to his. There was a
Yes.
whole series of poems which were almost written to a
Right.
formula. And when he went abroad, finally, that freed him up. He was writing for himself.
Yes.
He was no longer
Sure.
writing for other people.
As a bestseller, incidentally, I mean, books like this, which come from the middle of the
Yes.
19th century, these must have been printed in vast numbers.
Huge numbers.
Yes.
He was the best-selling poet in English right into the 20th century,
Yes.
by far. And he's still the most read English writer after Shakespeare globally.
Right. Yes.
Which people in Britain sometimes feel rather surprised about,
Yes.
because of course we have other romantic poets that perhaps we value more.
Indeed.
But
yes.
looking globally,
Shelley and
Shelley,
yes,
Wordsworth particularly.
Yes, yes, exactly.
But
yes.
globally, he's next
Yes.
to Shakespeare.
So to sum up, before I come on to one or two questions to you, Sir Drummond, about yourself, to sum up, you would say that there was a clear connection between the extraordinary life that this man led and the poetry that he wrote, and that therefore saying that you have to know life in order to write about it, he exemplifies in his own life.
He does, but there's one thing I would add to that, and that is that if one thinks of his life as a bit chaotic, mad, bad and dangerous to know,
Yes.
the poetry is anything but chaotic. The
Indeed
late poetry
so.
is very highly structured.
Yes.
And it's interesting too that in his politics, he was a much more practical revolutionary than any of the other British romantic poets.
Right.
And when he was in Italy and when he was in Greece, he was very organised.
Right.
He turned out to be really rather a good administrator, in fact, actually,
Right.
in both Italy and Greece. So there's this odd contradiction. On the one hand, the chaotic life, just sucking up any experience that
Yes.
comes his way,
Yes.
and this technician and organiser in both his verse and in his political life.
And his political life, just briefly on that, he was a revolutionary.
I don't think he was. There's an interesting little phrase here in the very next stanza, which I didn't read, but which
Yes.
I might just try. He says, so that I verily believe, if they who now are basking in their full-blown pride, in other words, the kings and queens,
Yes.
were shaken down, and dogs had had their day, though at the first I might perchance deride their tumble, I should turn the other way, and wax an ultra-royalist in loyalty, because I hate even democratic royalty.
Oh my goodness.
Um,
So there's nuanced
Absolutely.
aspects to his saying, as it were, bring the house down, but...
But, exactly. But.
So,
And
yes.
I think that leads to a lot of controversy about his political views.
Yes.
A bit like his sexuality. Some camps want to appropriate him to one
Yes.
and some to the other.
Yes.
And some radicals see him as a great radical, and on the other hand, some conservatives see him as at heart a conservative.
Yes. Yes.
He's very difficult to
So,
picture.
like any really major character in literary life, he's actually quite complicated
He's
to
quite complicated.
really fully understand.
That's it.
I'd like now, if I may, Sir Drummond, turn to you, because you're an interesting character too. If I understand you right, you race Maserati cars?
It's all true, I'm afraid. Yes.
Well, don't be afraid. This is fascinating. I haven't come across any president of a university who goes around, racing a Maserati car.
Well, that of course, that started a long while before I was president of that.
Indeed, yes, indeed. But they selected you despite that.
I think maybe at first they didn't know.
Right.
I think there's a journal in England you will know called it used to be called the Times Higher Education Literary Supplement.
Oh yes,
and then they outed
the Eggheads Journal.
The Eggheads Journal, and then they outed me. And I think there are a number of vice chancellors actually. Presidents have rather strange hobbies. Some fly, so I'm not
unique in that respect.
But I may be unique in actually.
Look, what is it? Is it the thrill of being there behind this machine that is going at fast speed? I mean, this is not me, so I don't know how. What is it?
Well, it sounds terribly pretentious to say it, perhaps, Henry, but it's about rhythm, it's about balance, it's about visualization, and put all these things another way, it's about pattern recognition. And isn't that what all intellectual life's about? It's about pattern recognition.
So you even intellectualize your racing.
Well, people ask me these questions, so I have to.
You have to have a way of doing that. Yes, that's right. So the last question I'd like to put to you is this. This is very much a desert islandist type of question, isn't it? If you hadn't worked on romantic poetry, irony, Byron in particular, what would you have done? Would you have been a racing car driver? Or is there something else that would have been very much your wish for life?
Well, there was a moment when I thought about racing professionally, but thank goodness I decided not to do it.
Right.
But no, I'd have been a writer, I think.
Yes.
I do write short stories, I write short fiction, and I think that's where it would have gone.
Writing yourself.
Writing myself rather than studying other people's writing, yes.
Well, Sir Drummond Bone, thank you very much for talking to Voices from Oxford. We have greatly enjoyed hearing partly about your own work, partly about the extraordinary life and poetry of Lord Byron, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.